The dawn was colorless, the kind of pale gray that makes even the living look like ghosts. It was January of 1945 somewhere on Luzon. The war had shifted, but no one here felt any victory. Japanese women, prisoners, nurses, clerks, even a few. Civilians stood in a ragged line, their breath forming weak clouds in the morning chill. The ground was mud mixed with ash. A stray dog barked once and went quiet again. Then came the voice, "Unbutton your shirts." The American sergeant's tone wasn't cruel. It was flat, procedural, military. But to the women it fell like a blade. No one moved at first, their hands clutched fabric tight, eyes darting toward the soldiers, then to each other. For Japanese women, obedience was sacred, but so was modesty. One nurse, barely 20, whispered, "They will shame us before death." The wind hissed through torn canvas and made the silence colder. One by one, trembling fingers began undoing buttons. The sound was soft, but unbearable metal clicking against metal, cloth, brushing damp skin. An American medic stepped closer, his flashlight trembling in his gloved hand. Steam rose from their shoulders where cold met fear. He wasn't smirking. He wasn't watching for pleasure. He was scanning for something else. Behind the line, another medic muttered, "Frostbite setting in." The sergeant nodded once. That was the reason. They weren't stripping the prisoners for humiliation. They were checking for the signs of hypothermia in this damp valley. Temperatures dropped low enough to kill a weakened person in hours, and these women had walked barefoot for miles before capture, but no one told them why. To the P, it still felt like punishment disguised as mercy. One nurse fainted before her shirt was halfway open. A medic caught her before she hit the ground, his voice urgent. "Get her near the drum now." Still, most of them believed this was an act of domination. Their shame ran deeper than the cold, deeper than any wound. In their culture, bearing oneself before men, especially enemies, was the end of dignity. The sergeant didn't know this. He only knew the regulations. Check for frostbite. Treat. Move on. Yet that single order, spoken without cruelty, taken with fear, would become the spark for everything that followed. Because the order wasn't about humiliation, it was about survival. The flashlights flickered like nervous fireflies as the American medics moved down the line. Their boots sank in the muck, and the smell of wet canvas and kerosene filled the air. The women stood half, buttoned, shivering violently, eyes locked on the ground. It looked like humiliation, but it wasn't. It was triage. The Americans were hunting for the silent killer that had already claimed men stronger than these women frostbite and pneumonia. A medic named Corporal Lewis muttered, their skins going blue. He peeled a sleeve higher on one prisoner's arm and hissed through his teeth. The flesh was waxy white, edges gray. Another woman coughed, a deep rattling sound that made everyone freeze. The sergeant barked, Blankets! Get those damn blankets! Reports later said nearly 70% of P in these jungle edge camps showed early hypothermia symptoms. But in that moment, nobody cared about statistics. They cared about who would survive the next sunrise. The women didn't understand the sudden urgency. One asked in broken English why you do this. The medic didn't answer. He just wrapped her in a wool blanket and kept moving. To her, the act was confusing kindness. To him, it was protocol. Steam began to rise where body heat met the morning chill. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and fear. The camp doctor, a weary major who hadn't slept in 2 days, scribbled notes by lantern light. Immediate medical risk. Temperature near 40 degrees Fahrenheit. No shelter sufficient. Later in her diary, one nurse would write, "We did not realize they were saving us." In that fragile, humiliating moment, survival was wrapped in misunderstanding. As dawn brightened, the medics worked faster, stripping off wet clothing, rubbing circulation back into limbs. The women's protests grew quieter as exhaustion replaced fear. Every few minutes, the doctor shouted for hot rations or warm water, but there was barely any fuel left. The Americans were improvising, trading spare socks for makeshift bandages, cutting their own blankets in half. When the line finally thinned, the sergeant looked around. The women were alive, trembling, but breathing. He wiped sweat and rain from his brow and muttered, "That's the last of them." Their biggest battle anymore. It was shame. By midday the rain had stopped, but the air carried that biting chill that sinks through bone. The women huddled near a rusted fence, shirts clutched tightly around their chests. No one spoke. They weren't thinking about cold anymore. They were thinking about shame. For Japanese women, modesty wasn't just a rule. It was a code written into their honor. To expose oneself before men, especially foreign soldiers, was a fate worse than death. One nurse, Ayako, stared at her hands as if they no longer belonged to her. Her fingers were cracked from frost and trembling from humiliation. She whispered to another prisoner, "They want to break us." The other replied, "Let them. We are already ghosts." The words drifted into the wind, barely heard over the distant clang of mess tins. Some refused the medic's inspection outright. One woman, feverish and shaking, pressed her arms tight to her body, even as her skin turned blotchy white from the cold. Within minutes she collapsed. The medics rushed forward, trying to revive her, but her pulse faded. The sergeant cursed softly. He knew they were losing more to pride than to temperature. According to Japanese Red Cross archives, roughly 1 in 5 female P in the Luzon camps suffered severe hypothermia that winter. But numbers don't capture the deeper wound, the silent war between dignity and survival. When the doctor ordered the next group to line up, a wave of resistance spread. Several turned their backs, refusing to face the men. The Americans, baffled, looked to their interpreter, who finally explained, "For them, this is dishonor worse than pain." Something shifted in the sergeant's expression. He stepped back, eyes narrowing, not in anger, but in realization. These women weren't defying him. They were defending what little identity they had left. He didn't speak again for a long moment. The wind rattled the tin roof, and someone coughed blood into a rag. In his field notes that evening, he wrote simply, "They'd rather freeze than be seen." It was the first time the Americans understood what this really was, a battle not of armies, but of worlds. By nightfall, the camp had to choose between saving lives or preserving their captives' dignity, and the sergeant knew there had to be another way. The next morning, mist rolled low over the camp, thick enough to blur the watchtowers into pale ghosts. The women were huddled in corners, clutching rags around their shoulders. The Americans moved slower today, quieter, less commanding. Something had changed after the previous night's refusal. The sergeant, a man of routine and rule-books, had spent the dark hours pacing, thinking. When dawn came, he gave a new order. Raise the blankets, make screens. The men looked confused but followed. They strung ropes between tent poles, hanging blankets like makeshift walls. It wasn't much, just a patchwork of khaki fabric, but to the prisoners it was everything. For the first time since capture, they were unseen. Behind those walls they could unbutton their uniforms without 1,000 eyes watching. The medics worked quickly, checking wounds, rubbing limbs to restore warmth, replacing soaked bandages. The women didn't speak English, but their silence felt different now. It wasn't defiance. It was relief. A strange quiet, almost grateful. There were only 60 blankets in the entire camp, barely enough for 200 prisoners. The Americans tore their own bedding in half, cutting down the seams. One corporal muttered, "We'll freeze too." The sergeant replied, "Then we freeze together." It was a small act, but it rippled through both sides. The Japanese P, once certain of enemy cruelty, now saw something alien respect. One nurse whispered to her companion, "They shielded us like brothers." By noon a rhythm emerged. One row of women treated while others stood watch, guarding the fabric walls from wind. The air inside smelled of iodine and wet wool. Outside, guards kept distance, eyes averted by command. That afternoon, the interpreter delivered an unexpected message from the prisoners. "We thank you for letting us keep our honor." It wasn't flowery or exaggerated, just plain words spoken through chapped lips. The sergeant read the translation twice, then folded it into his notebook. For the first time since landing in Luzon, he smiled. "Maybe we're learning something out here," he murmured. And as the blankets flapped gently in the wind, the invisible line between captor and captive thinned. The walls meant protection, but they also built a fragile bridge of trust. By evening, warmth returned, and so did the sound of laughter, faint but real. Night fell early that day. The fog thickened, and the camp turned into a blur of shadow and glimmering rain. Inside the fenced yard, the smell of rust and smoke mixed with something new. Kerosene. The Americans had found an old oil drum behind the mess tent and decided to turn it into a heater. Someone poured in what little fuel they had left. Another jammed a pipe through the side and lit it. The fire coughed, then roared alive. The sergeant stood back as orange light washed over the mud. "Keep it steady," he said. The medics carried the weakest women toward the heat. Their skin glistened under the flicker, steam rising off their damp shirts. For the first time in days, warmth returned. You could see it on their faces, the tight frozen lines slowly easing into something human again. It wasn't luxury. It was survival in its rawest form. The Americans broke open ration tins, melting cocoa tablets into metal cups. The Japanese women sipped cautiously, tasting both sweetness and disbelief. The sound of the fire drowned out the camp's usual clatter. For a few quiet minutes there was no war, just breathing and warmth. Temperature that night hovered around 40 Wonderdef, low enough to pull the life from an exhausted body. The medics knew the numbers too well. They'd seen frost bite-eat through skin in Europe, and they weren't about to watch it happen here. One nurse whispered in Japanese, "Their fire smells like home cooking." Her friend nodded, eyes reflecting the flame. That scent, burnt fuel and tin, reminded them of stoves from another life, another country that now lay in ruins. The sergeant crouched near the barrel, rubbing his hands. He didn't understand the words, but he caught the tone. Grateful, fragile, human. He passed a small metal cup toward them. "Drink up," he said softly. No one translated it, but they understood anyway. Steam rose higher, turning into a curtain between captor and captive. In its wavering glow, lines blurred again. For one night, compassion burned hotter than hatred. As dawn crept in, the fire shrank to embers, but something else stayed alive. The idea that warmth could come from the unlikeliest hands, and that warmth would lead to the next mercy. Food. The morning began with a hiss, the sound of rice boiling in a dented tin pot. Inside the mess tent, the air was thick with steam and the tang of smoke. An American cook stirred the mixture with a bayonet, muttering, "Never thought I'd be cooking for the enemy." But hunger has a way of erasing battle lines. Behind him, crates of field rations stood half-empty meat cans, biscuit tins, and a single sack of captured Japanese rice marked with kanji faded by rain. That morning the Americans decided to mix the two. A little rice, a little sugar, a pinch of salt. Nothing fancy. But to the Japanese women waiting outside, it smelled like life itself. They hadn't eaten properly in days. Their bodies were thin as bamboo rods, their eyes dulled from fatigue. Each bowl held barely 900 calories, half what a soldier was supposed to get. But the effect was instant. The women cupped their hands around the warm tins, breathing in steam before daring a bite. A few cried quietly, the tears rolling into the rice. Across the tent, one American medic watched in silence. "They are just people," he finally said. The sergeant didn't answer, but his jaw tightened. "Or teaches you to dehumanize the other side, but it can't hold when you're sharing a meal." Outside, the rain turned into a drizzle, dripping through the cracks in the roof. The women began whispering among themselves, voices soft but steady. "We could taste humanity again," one wrote later in her journal. The Americans didn't understand the words, but they saw the change in posture. Shoulders no longer slumped, eyes no longer hollow. For a few hours the camp felt less like a prison and more like a hospital. The medics and the prisoners moved in the same rhythm, feeding, cleaning, caring, yet not everyone in uniform approved. From the far tent, a lieutenant's voice carried over the sound of spoons against metal. "You're treating them like guests, Sergeant." The sergeant didn't look up. "They'll die otherwise," he replied, tone even, gaze fixed on the rice steaming in his cup. But that quiet defiance wouldn't go unnoticed. The act of feeding the enemy would soon draw attention from higher ranks, and punishment was coming. The rain stopped, but tension didn't. The smell of cooked rice still lingered in the camp when boots thundered toward the mess tent. Lieutenant Harris Young, polished and furious, stormed in. His voice cut through the chatter like a whip. "What the hell is this, Sergeant?" "A charity kitchen. Every man froze. The Japanese women mid-meal instinctively set their tins down. The Sergeant Davis didn't rise from his seat. He just looked up slowly, the way a man does when he knows the rules, but chooses to break them anyway. "Sir," he said quietly, "they're P. They need food to live." The lieutenant's jaw clenched. "You're feeding them like guests. Orders say minimum rations." Davis held his ground. "Minimum gets them dead." The silence after that was sharp enough to cut. Outside the wind pushed through the cracks in the tent, making the lantern sway. The women watched tense, not understanding the words, but reading the tone. They could tell the argument was about them. Later, reports showed that 18 medics were disciplined that month for overstepping P protocol. Feeding the enemy was seen as weakness, but to the men here it was simple arithmetic. Starvation meant corpses, and corpses meant failure. Lieutenant Harris finally snapped, "You'll write a full report explaining this insubordination." "Yes, sir," Davis said. Then, after a pause, "Make sure you include that they are still alive." For a moment no one breathed. Then the lieutenant turned and left, his anger echoing through the metal drums outside. Davis exhaled, running a hand over his face. "War makes fools of all of us," he muttered. When he stepped outside, several of the women stood waiting near the fence. One of them, the nurse who'd collapsed days earlier, bowed slightly, pressing her palms together in thanks. Davis nodded once. No smile, no words, just understanding. That night the guards whispered, "He risked punishment for them." One said, "Guess he's gone soft." But another replied, "Or maybe he remembered what we're supposed to be fighting for." In the darkness, the camp's small fire flickered, its glow reaching both sides of the wire. The line between compassion and defiance was now blurred beyond recognition, and tomorrow it would blur even more. Night draped over the camp like a heavy blanket, thick with humidity and the faint buzz of insects. Inside one of the barracks, a crude structure of bamboo and tarpaulin, a single candle burned low. The flickering light revealed a young Japanese nurse hunched over a torn scrap of notebook paper. Her name was Misako, and her hand shook as she wrote. "They treat us better than our own officers." The words came slowly, almost painfully. She hadn't written anything personal since her capture. For weeks she'd been a ghost, eating, sleeping, obeying, but not feeling. That sentence changed everything. The diary passed quietly from hand to hand the next morning. It was small, wrapped in fabric and hidden in a shoe sole during inspections. Each woman read it, eyes widening a little more, as if those words gave permission to think the unthinkable. That kindness could come from the enemy. By dawn, the air in the camp felt subtly different. The women moved with more steadiness. The medics noticed fewer arguments, fewer tears. The diary had become a spark, a fragile bridge between two worlds built not of politics, but of survival and gratitude. Out near the wire, Davis watched the women gather around the fire drum, sharing bits of cocoa powder like children. He didn't know about the diary, but he saw the change. One medic whispered, "Feels calmer, doesn't it?" Davis nodded. For now, there were only 12 diaries ever documented from female P in those Luzon camps. Only one would survive post-war censorship, and this might have been it. In her later testimony, Misako wrote, "We began to question everything we were taught. That single line carried more weight than rifles or flags, because when a belief cracks, an entire system trembles. These women had been raised to see the Americans as beasts, brutal, dishonorable, soulless. But every act of mercy carved another line through that myth. As the sun set, the diary returned to Misako's hands. She read her own words again and whispered, "Maybe there is another kind of victory." She didn't know it yet, but her quiet realization would ripple outward. To one woman, who would soon step out of the shadows and change the entire camp's story. The next morning began with shouting, but not from anger. "Medic, we need a translator," a voice called across the camp. A young Japanese nurse stepped forward, uncertain but steady. Her name was Kyoko, 24 years old, once assigned to a hospital ship in the Pacific before it went down under American bombardment. She had survived floating 2 nights on wreckage before capture. Now in a camp where survival was measured by the hour, she was about to become something else, a bridge. Yoko spoke broken English, learned from medical manuals and the shortwave broadcasts she'd secretly listened to during the war. When the sergeant asked if she could help translate symptoms, she nodded. That nod changed everything. By mid-morning, she was walking between rows of CS, whispering questions in Japanese, translating the women's answers to American medics. Pain in chest, cough, 2 days, fever. Her tone was flat, professional, but behind it was quiet determination. For the first time, the medics could treat the women properly. There were 37 Japanese P women assisting in Allied medical units across the Philippines by March of 1945. Most were untrained. Kyoko wasn't. Her skill impressed even the hard-faced doctor who rarely praised anyone. He noted in his journal, "Enemy nurse effective, works with discipline, no fear." That afternoon, Davis watched her carefully disinfecting a wound, her movements sharp and practiced. "She's one of theirs?" he asked the medic beside him. "Was," came the reply. Later, Kyoko confided to another prisoner, "I wanted to return what they gave me. Warmth." The others listened silently. That word, warmth, had become sacred in the camp, meaning more than temperature. It meant decency, safety, the faint return of trust. By evening, she was part of the daily routine, her presence changing the rhythm of the camp. When she passed by, soldiers lowered their voices. She commanded quiet respect, not through rank, but through purpose. Davis noticed, too, the way the women looked to her for cues, the way her calm steadied chaos. She wasn't just translating language. She was translating humanity between enemies. But in a war still raging beyond the fence, such closeness was dangerous, and soon the line between cooperation and connection would draw unwanted eyes from both sides. The camp had settled into a fragile rhythm. Medics treating, prisoners helping, guards pretending not to notice. But one quiet afternoon shattered that balance. Near the medical tent, Kyoko stood talking with Lieutenant Harris, the same officer who once reprimanded Sergeant Davis for feeding the prisoners. From a distance it looked harmless. 2 people speaking softly beside a crate of bandages. Up close it looked like treason. A corporal spotted them and froze. "Sir shouldn't be alone with her," he whispered to another guard. Word spread fast. Within an hour, rumors rippled through the camp like fever. The lieutenant's getting too close to a prisoner. Harris wasn't flirting. He was asking Kyoko how she'd learned English. But perception in war is its own weapon. Later, when Davis confronted him, the lieutenant bristled. I was questioning her medical knowledge, he said sharply. Davis replied. Then why do you look guilty? That night, both were summoned for questioning Harris for improper conduct, Kyoko for compromising cooperation. The irony was bitter. The nurse who had saved lives was now accused of overstepping invisible lines. Records from 1945 mentioned 12 fraternization incidents reported among Allied-run P camps. Most were innocent. Shared cigarettes, shared stories, but each threatened the illusion of distance that command depended on. Soldiers could treat the enemy, feed them, even protect them, but they were never supposed to see them. When Kyoko faced interrogation, she bowed deeply and said in halting English, "We are enemies by rule, not by heart." The interpreter paused, unsure how to translate that without starting another argument. In the silence that followed, even Harris looked down. Davis later wrote in his notes, "Lines cross themselves in war. Some we draw, others we erase without meaning to." For 2 days, Kyoko was confined to a separate tent. The medics protested quietly, refusing to work without her. By the 3rd morning, the doctor stepped in and ended the punishment. "We're here to save lives, not police decency," he said flatly. When she returned to duty, Kyoko didn't smile, but the camp breathed easier. Still, something had shifted. Compassion now carried a cost, and as the sound of distant artillery rolled through the valley, everyone sensed it. The war outside was closing in fast. By mid-August of 1945, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Days stretched quiet and heavy, broken only by the crackle of radios in the command hut. Outside the wire, Sikas droned endlessly as if mocking the silence of men who waited for history to decide their fate. Inside the camp, even the guards stopped shouting. The women could feel something shifting, a tremor not from artillery but from rumor. One afternoon the news came. Japan was surrendering. The message arrived on a crackling radio set. Half broken, half believed. A voice read the words slowly, translated by the interpreter with trembling lips. "The Emperor has spoken, all fighting must cease." For a long moment no one reacted. Then the women began to cry, some from grief, some from relief, some from shame so deep it had no sound. Kyoko sat on the ground staring at her hands. She had dreamed of this moment for months, yet it didn't feel like victory or defeat. It felt like the earth had tilted beneath her. Around her, women sobbed into their sleeves while the Americans looked away, giving them privacy they couldn't have imagined weeks before. By the end of that month, there were over 50,000 Japanese P in American custody across the Pacific. On paper, that number marked surrender. In reality, it marked confusion. The war was over, but none of them knew who they were without it. That evening, Sergeant Davis stood by the fence, watching the sunset turn the barbed wire gold. A medic approached quietly. "Guess it's done," he said. Davis nodded. "No," he replied. "It's changing shape." Across the yard, one of the women approached the fence and whispered in Japanese, "Now what happens to us?" No one answered. Kyoko walked slowly toward the clinic tent, the same place she had once stood as a captive, then a helper, then a suspect. Now she walked like someone between worlds, neither free nor bound, neither victor nor vanquished. From the far hills came the faint echo of celebration, American soldiers firing flares into the sky. The light didn't reach the camp, only the sound. Inside the fence there were no cheers, only quiet breathing, because for those still behind the wire, surrender wasn't an ending. It was an unfamiliar beginning waiting to be defined. Days after Japan's surrender, the camp began to change. The barbed wire stayed up, but the gates opened more often. Trucks rolled in with supply crates instead of rifles. For the first time in months, the guards didn't count prisoners. They called them by name. The war was finished, yet no one felt finished inside. Repatriation lists arrived printed on coarse paper, names written in neat military type. Each prisoner was to be processed, denounced, examined, then shipped home. But home was a complicated word. Many had no idea what waited for them beyond the ocean. Families gone, cities turned to ash, reputations ruined by surrender. When Kyoko's name appeared on the list, she stared at it for a long time. Her hand didn't move. She was supposed to feel joy. Instead, she felt a pull she couldn't name. That night, she walked to the clinic tent where Sergeant Davis was packing up medical supplies for transport. "You're free now," he said. She hesitated. Free to go where? Davis didn't answer. He knew that silence, the sound of someone realizing the world they belonged to, no longer existed. The next morning, when the trucks lined up, Kyoko didn't climb aboard. Instead, she stood beside the American medics, sleeves rolled up, tending to the feverish men from another camp. She volunteered, the interpreter explained. She says she can still help. Reports indicate that around 2% of Japanese P in Allied custody chose to remain temporarily under post or service. Some stayed for months, a few for years, working as nurses, translators, or clerks. For Kyoko, it wasn't loyalty to either flag. It was loyalty to the act of healing. The Americans didn't know what to do with her request, so they did the simplest thing. They let her stay. She moved through the camp like a ghost of both sides, Japanese by birth, Allied by duty, human by choice. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Davis found her standing near the gate, watching the departing trucks. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly. She nodded once. "I found a different kind of honor." That answer silenced him. In war, obedience was easy. But this staying behind to rebuild what hate had burned took another kind of courage. By early 1946, the camp was barely recognizable. The wire still stood, but wild grass grew between the posts. The huts that once echoed with orders now buzzed with hammers and saws. The Americans were rebuilding hospitals. The Japanese prisoners were helping. And in the middle of this fragile peace, a war correspondent from the U.S. Signal Corps arrived with a battered Leica camera. He was told to document reconstruction efforts. He expected routine shots. Soldiers unloading crates, medics bandaging wounds, trucks on dirt roads. What he captured instead became one of the most haunting images of the post-war Pacific. In the center of the frame, Kyoko, head slightly bowed, wrapping gauze around the arm of an American soldier. Her hands were steady, her face unreadable. Around them, other prisoners worked quietly, some mending uniforms, some boiling water, all under the same tropical light that once illuminated battlefields. The photographer clicked the shutter once. The sound was small, but it froze an entire transformation in a single instant. Enemy turned healer, prisoner turned protector. When the photo reached Manila, editors didn't know what to do with it. Was it propaganda redemption? Contradiction? They published it anyway. Captioned simply, "Japanese nurse assists Allied soldier." Luzon, 1946. It circulated in newspapers across both nations, then in magazines, then in museums. Years later, at a reconciliation exhibit in Tokyo, it hung under a soft spotlight. Visitors stared at it in silence. One woman whispered, "That photo became our surrender flag." The image told a story no headline could. How compassion can survive even in the ashes of ideology. It didn't erase the horrors of the war, but it complicated them. It showed that kindness was not weakness. It was resistance against everything that dehumanization had built. Back in the camp, Kyoko never saw the printed photograph. She was still working long hours, stitching wounds, cleaning instruments, carrying stretchers. Davis once watched her bandage a soldier who'd once guarded her, and he understood then war ends not with treaties, but with small human mercies. But behind that photo, behind the legend it would become, lay one forgotten moment that started it all. The cold morning when a single order shattered pride, then slowly rebuilt trust. Decades later, the war had become black and white film reels and museum exhibits. The Luzon camp was gone, swallowed by vines, its watchtowers crumbling like forgotten gravestones. But the story refused to die. It lived in memory and scars, and in one phrase that survivors never forgot: unbutton your shirts. In 1972, an NHK documentary gathered the few remaining women who had survived that winter. Only 11 were still alive. They sat in a small studio under bright lights, their hands wrinkled but steady, their eyes distant. When the interviewer asked what they remembered most, the room fell quiet. Then one of them, Misako, the nurse who'd written the diary, smiled faintly and said, "The order? We thought it was shame. It was rescue." The camera zoomed in as she described that freezing dawn, the confusion, the fear, the trembling hands undoing buttons that felt heavier than chains. "We believed they wanted to humiliate us," she said, "but they wanted to save us. They saw our suffering before we did." Footage cut to another survivor, her voice barely above a whisper. "They saved our bodies and something in our souls." The audience didn't breathe. Even the interpreter's voice cracked as he translated. For decades the story had been twisted, some calling it cruelty, others mercy. But in that broadcast, truth settled in between those extremes. It wasn't about heroism or humiliation. It was about a moment where compassion broke through the fog of hate. Historians later analyzed it as a rare case of reverse perception shock, when cultural misunderstanding creates both trauma and transformation. What the Americans saw as a medical procedure, the Japanese women saw as dishonor. Yet from that misunderstanding, something profound emerged. Empathy. Kyoko never appeared in the documentary. She had passed years earlier, buried quietly near Manila. But when the film ended, the credits rolled over the photograph, the one of her bandaging the American soldier. The image faded slowly to black, the way old film does when it's near its end. The narrator's voice spoke one last line. "Sometimes mercy doesn't look like kindness at first, but time remembers the difference."